Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started so that we can get through everything and answer any questions that you might have. My name is Amber Chambers. I'm the graphic designer here at the diocese, and I'm always here to help any parish, mission, office, school, anybody who needs help here in the diocese with design or print services. So I am going to be discussing file formats today, and some you might know of, some you might be confused about, and others you may have never heard of, and you might never use them. But just going to go through some basic things, and then we will take questions throughout. So stop me at any time if you need me to. So we'll start with what is a file format. So a file format is a structure of a file that tells the program how it should display it. So for a .doc, a Word file, if you tried to open it in any other program other than Word, it wouldn't open because it is only formulated to open in Microsoft Word. So the extension, which is .doc, is just for Word. So why do I need to know about file formats? Understanding file formats will help you create and share documents correctly so that they present on others' screens correctly. And this happens most frequently when you try to send a document from one word to another person's Word, and you might use an interesting font that you have, but when someone opens the file on their computer, they don't have that font. So they it'll mess up the formatting. It'll try to throw another font in, and then all your formatting goes berserk and things don't line up right. So understanding a file format will help you to send your documents so that other people will be able to read it exactly as you intend them to see it. So for example, most print shops require you to send projects as a .pdf or a .eps. So creating one of those files, if you don't send them the correct file format, it will print incorrectly or it'll be really fuzzy and poor quality. So always understanding what they want and how to do it will help you get your message across clearly. So we're going to begin with the ones that are most common, and it's the Microsoft file formats. The first one is a .doc, and this is a text-based file format, and it is specific to Word itself. Usually you cannot edit it in anything other than Word, but Microsoft has created some other programs that you can open in. But generally speaking, if you don't have Word, you can't open it. So then we go to a .ppt. Now this is a PowerPoint. That is how I made this presentation. And this one was also created by Microsoft, but unlike the other applications, this one can be opened on many different platforms, including Apple Keynote and OpenOffice Impress. So it's a little more versatile than Microsoft Word. The .pub, which is publisher, again, it is solely a Microsoft application, and it does comprise of, as you know, of graphics, images, text, but it can't be opened on any Macintosh computer. So if you're ever sending me a file, I work on a Microsoft computer. And so if you send me a publisher document, I cannot open it. It's not supported by Apple solely because Macintosh has a plethora of other programs that do the exact same thing, but better. So they don't, that's the main reason that it doesn't support publisher. Does anybody have any questions yet? You good? Okay. So who does it better, a XLS or a CSV? You might be looking at this going, I don't even know what those are, but we'll go through it and I'll explain. So a .xls is an Excel file. So when you go into Excel and you create a document and you save it, it'll save as a .xls. This kind of a document can have everything that's inside of the workbook, including charts and images, formulas, and those sort of things. You can only open it through Google Sheets or Excel. The .csv is it stands for comma separated values. And this file, you would start with a Excel file, and then you would save it as a CSV. And it pretty much just flattens all your data down to just what you need, just the content. It doesn't have all the images or graphs or formulas. So the difference is that the CSV file can be opened in any format, many different text editors or spreadsheet programs. It really depends on what you're planning on doing with your Excel file as to which one would be best, but most of the time, the CSV file is the one you want to move if you have to move your data from one place to another. If you have to send your Excel sheet to someone that is going to do a mail merge onto something, you would want to save it as a CSV file so that they can get all the proper information in a very small format. The Excel file could end up not opening correctly or displaying correctly. So a CSV file would be what you would use if you needed to send an Excel document for something like a mail merge. So what is up with a .zip? So whenever you are going to be sending many different files, you want to put them all together. So a zipped file, if you select more than one file, you can right click and you can zip it together. And it's basically like taking all your files from your desk, putting it into a suitcase and zipping it up so that you can take it to another place. You put it all together nice and neat. So a zipped file does the exact same thing. It'll take many documents or files and it'll zip it all together into one file so that it can be sent at a lower file size. It's excellent for when you need to send more than one file within an email that might go over your file size recommendations for email. So compressing them and sending them all together is what you would want to do. And that gives you the .zip extension. So if you ever see the .zip, all you have to do is double click on it and the file will open. We're going to move on to design and image files. These are the three main programs that I use to create my projects. You will probably never need any of these or use any of these, but these are the files that I use. So the first one is a .ai, which is Adobe Illustrator, and it creates vector images. We will get into what a vector image is later. This is important with many different things like logos, because vector files can be resized really, really large or teeny, teeny, tiny, and it doesn't lose any resolution. It doesn't become pixelated. It doesn't look any different on a pen as it would on a giant billboard. A PSD file is a Photoshop application, and Photoshop is what I use to edit photos. If I ever need to put a take a power line out of a photograph or cut someone out of a photograph so that there's no background behind them, this is the application that I would use to do that. Then there is the InDesign. InDesign is what I use to create mostly everything I do when it comes to books, magazines, newspapers, flyers, and brochures. It is a page layout program, and it ends with the .ndd. So again, these are just an overview of what I use on my daily work. So moving on to photo formats. So now we're going to be talking about the difference between JPEG, TIFF, and GIF files. This will probably concern everybody most of the time because it's the most widely used. So a .jpg, it actually stands for Joint Photographic Experts Group, which is actually the group that created the JPEG file format. So what a JPEG does is it compresses the data in the photo. Now, depending on how much it compresses it, depends on how big or small you want your file to be. The good thing about a JPEG is that you can take a large picture and you can make it a small file format if you're only needing it to use it once. But if you tried to take that file that you made smaller and you want to make it bigger, then it's going to be pixelated because it has compressed the photo down. And what I mean by that is it takes away pixels that it doesn't feel it needs. So if there is a spot that uses a lot of the same color, like the sky might have a lot of the same shades of blue, it'll compress those pixels together so that it can save space and it can save file size. Again, the problem with that is that once it's that size and then you try to make it big again, then it ends up being extremely pixelated. Resaving JPEGs, every time you resave a JPEG, it compresses it more and more and more. And that's why sometimes when you go onto Google and you select an image, sometimes you can select the same image twice and one will be just fine and one will be extremely pixelated. And it's because of how many times it's been compressed. So the least amount of times of compression is much better. When you are going on to Google, when you're looking for photographs, always use the tool at the top of Google where you can choose a file size and always choose large. And then you'll want to look at the file size to determine whether that photograph will work for you. If it's anything under like 300, like sometimes it'll say 300 by 300, for instance, and I can show you this in a minute. It's not going to be a good enough resolution. But if it says that it's, say, 1200, then, and I'll show you where to find that, then it would be a good photo to use. We'll go, if we have time, I'll show you that after the presentation here. The next is a .tiff file. That stands for tagged image file format. So this is a way that you can save a file or a photograph so that it will not compress. Even if it is a JPEG file, you can save it as a TIFF format and you can resize it as many times as you need to, saving it as a TIFF, and it will not compress and it will not lose its, it will not lose all the data and become pixelated. Even if you have a file that, a JPEG file that has been downsized, If you save it as a TIFF, then it won't downsize anymore until you save it as a JPEG again. So if you have a file that you want to use repeatedly, saving it as a TIFF would be a very good idea so that it doesn't continue to deteriorate every time it's saved. Now these files too, I must say, are usually larger in file size. So depending on what you're using it for, it will be a much higher file size. So now we have a GIF file. These are it's called a lossless format for image file. It means it doesn't lose any of its information. The only thing is with GIFs is that they do not produce all the colors. They only produce about 256 colors. So the color is limited. It also is a small file size. So that's why they oftentimes will look slightly pixelated. The idea that they were originally were created for web graphics. And these files were made so small so that they would upload quickly and not slow down any of the websites that might be loading for you to look at. This file format was sort of on the downslide and was kind of dying out until they become popular again with Facebook and Twitter and social media. They're not very hard to create. They can be used in a lot of different scenarios, but this file, GIFs are not good to use for images. They're not, I try not to use them at all because they usually are just too pixelated for anything that I have to do. They are still used though in the web side of things on occasion. But if you can avoid using a GIF file, you should, because there's better file formats that you can use. .png, these are portable network graphics. So this is a raster graphic, and again, it is a lossless data compression, so it doesn't lose any of its information. So it was actually created to replace GIF. It is a much crisper, even though my image isn't the crispest, it is a much more crisp image, and it has a transparent background. That is what is so important about the .png. Only the .tiff and the .png really support a transparent background. So if you have a logo that you want to put on a colored background, you may want to have it, and you have to sort of take the background away, and you would save it as a transparent TIFF or a .png. If it's going onto the website, it has to be a .png file. Now that's something that I would normally take care of and send over to the web department. So if you ever have that need, please don't hesitate to ask. Whenever you create a JPEG, even if your original document had a transparent background, PNG automatically throws a white background behind it. So that's something to remember too. So when should you use these file formats? So JPEGs are most universal. So as long as the file size is the right size, JPEGs are what you would use on most everything. Social media, websites, any type of printed materials that aren't super large, and ads. As long as the file format size is correct, then JPEGs are always the most universal. A TIFF file would be the most preferred for print, only so that you can print it at any size, and you can make sure that the quality of the image will be very nice and crisp and not pixelated. GIFs are primarily used for web graphics and web icons. And then your PNGs, again, are only used for web graphics mostly. And now we'll move on to the world of vector. So we're going to learn what a vector file is and what a raster file is. So a vector files are images that are built by mathematical formulas that establishes points on a grid. So a raster file, they're composed of blocks of color and pixels. Raster files are much smoother. As you can see in the picture, the edges are very, very smooth on this vector-based image. As I said earlier, when we kind of went over my Illustrator format, vector can be made extremely large or extremely small and never lose any detail. So you can use them if you're printing a pen, if you're printing your logo or your church name on a pen, or if you're doing a billboard. Giving a vector format will always make sure that your logo is always as crisp and clean as it should be. A raster file, on the other hand, it's a digital image, but it is fixed, and it uses a grid of X, Y, and then Z for 3D images. These images are almost look like they're staircases because they're fixed points. They don't move with the image. So it'll look crisp whenever it's small, but when you make it larger, you will see the steps and how fuzzy it is. Raster files are important for some things, but for graphic images like your logo or any icons and things of that nature, you're going to want a vector file so that it isn't all pixelated. Many times when I'm given a logo to redo, it's because it was never saved in the proper format. And so I recreate it to make it a vector file so that it can be used nice and crisp and clean, sort of revitalize it. So again, vector versus raster. The proof is in the pudding or in the image. So you can see the vector file is nice and crisp, but the raster file is extremely pixelated. Vector is always, so vector, or when I say, if you ever send anything to a print shop, they'll say they need a vector file. That also means a .eps file. And we're going to be moving to that in just a moment. So just going over again when you should use a vector file or a .eps file, and that is anytime you're printing graphics, not photographs, but graphics, any kind of icons or logos of that nature, you'll want to keep a vector file on hand for whenever you get anything printed. And this even includes if you're getting a t-shirt made, if you're getting a billboard, if you're getting pens or napkins, or pretty much anything that's printed, a vector file is the best thing to use, unless you're printing photographs. So the difference in, so we're going to talk about the two main vector formats. One of them I use regularly, the other one I rarely use. But I just wanted to let you know that there is more than one. The first one that is used most often is an EPS file, and it is designed for the use of printers and image setters. So anybody that's printing anything, this is what this file format was designed for. So if you are I'm trying to come up with, I'm trying to think of some other examples of the best time to use it, of what you might be doing, letterhead, anything of that nature. The EPS file format will just make sure that everything is printed extremely nice. So the .svg file format is also a vector, but it's also web, and it can be created to be animated as well. I don't use it very often. Very rarely will I use it. I think I've only used it maybe once or twice. So the EPS file is the one you'll look at. When I do any kind of logo, I always send multiple file formats, and this is one of them. And it's also the one that most people can't open. Only those that have a program to open it can open it, and that's usually a designer or a print shop. So a lot of times I will get a call that they can't open their file, and it turns out that it's the EPS file. And they get concerned because they can't see the file to make sure it's correct. And but it is definitely, if you can't open it, it's probably the right one to send to the printer. It's just the common thing that I get. So I've saved the best file format for last. The beauty of PDFs. PDFs are portable document formats. They are the best file format for sending anything to anyone at any time. The reason for that is because it contains everything needed to render the document. So the file itself has all the fonts, the images, the layout, the paper size, everything. So when they double click on that, it'll show exactly how it's supposed to show on any computer with no problem at all. It is the file format that I send for proofs for clients, for projects. If I want to send something to my husband to look at, it will open on pretty much anything. And now you can even open them on most phones. So the .pdf is always a great way to go. Word used to make you go into the print screen in order to save as a PDF. Thankfully, they've upgraded that. And now you can go to save as, and you can choose PDF as your option. If you recall earlier when I discussed about the .doc extension, and if you send a Word document to be printed, like if you were to send a Word document to me to be printed, I may not have the fonts that you have on your computer. And therefore, Word will end up throwing a different font in, and it'll completely mess up the layout and the structure of what you wanted me to print. So saving it as a PDF will make it very easy for me to open it up and print it exactly as you intend it to print. I do this a lot with worship aids. Someone will create a worship aid, usually in Publisher, and then it'll have to be sent to me as a PDF so that I can easily open it up, and it'll always print correctly the first time every time. So I strongly urge that if you ever have to send anything, to save it as a PDF before you send it, to make sure that it's being viewed exactly as you intend them to view it. So this one, before we move on to file naming, this just sort of tells you why we use certain things. So the PDF, the SVG, the Illustrator file, and the EPS file, those formats can all be scaled and not lose any of their information because they contain all the information. Files that can be edited include the PDF, the SVG, the same files actually. They're usually able to be edited if you have the correct programs to do so. The most universal files are your PDF, your JPEG, and your PNG. These files are universal with everybody. Everybody can usually open these, use these for various reasons. And then files that are transparent are the PDFs can have transparency, SVG, Illustrator, EPS, and PNG. Now, as you can see, one of the reasons that PDF is my favorite is because it is virtually and it's in every category because it is scalable, it's editable, it's universal, and you can have transparency. And now you can easily create fillable PDFs. So if you have a document that needs to be filled, you can play around with that, and you can actually make your PDFs, any PDF at that matter, a fillable document. I've done it with childcare. I have 2 kids that go to before and after care, and I have to fill out about a 30-page thing for both of them. So I created a fillable document so I could easily put in all of my information and not get a cramp doing it with a pen. So PDFs are really fantastic. Does anybody have any questions about all that? I know some of it was really,
Good, Kim. Can I call you back in just 2 minutes?
Was probably things you don't need to know.
Okay.
But also I just felt I wanted to make the connection as to how things work and go back and forth. So the last thing I'm going to discuss is going to be tips on file naming. So when we create any sort of file, we need to make sure that we are doing it so that we can find our files later. Because if we want to find them later and we go to search for them, but we don't remember what we named them or how we named them, then it can make it very difficult. So having a little system of how we do that is a great way. So the first thing you should do is always name them consistently. So if you wanted to put the office, what it is, and the year or the date, and always have that format, then you know how you could search for that particular file. So always having a consistency of file naming is really step number 1. So tip 2 is file names should be short but descriptive. So they shouldn't be a super, super, super long file name, but it should still have some information. Perhaps it is a office or an event, and a year. If it's an event that happens every single year, then always having a year in your file name is very helpful when you're trying to find the correct file. If you want to see a file from an event that happened 3 years ago, then it makes it a lot easier to find that file. Avoid using special characters or spaces. So you want to avoid using hashtags or $signs or dash marks, and especially periods. You want to avoid using periods and extra spaces. Some documents will not open if there are special characters or spaces in them. So oftentimes it'll say that a file is corrupted, and it's simply because there's a special character in the file name. So I go in, I change the file name, and then the file will open perfectly fine. So avoid special characters and spaces whenever you're naming things. Use capitals, underscores, instead of periods, spaces, or slashes. So oftentimes when I'm naming something, as you can see in the example on number 1, I'll put the office or the entity. So in this case, it was Catholic Charities, CCWVA, and an underscore, then it was their annual appeal, and then another underscore, and then 2020. That way I can easily see all the descriptive information very easily, but I kept it as short as I could. Use a date format such as month, day, year. or you could just use the year. Oftentimes, I only put the month and the year, or only the year if it's something that only happens yearly. If it's something that happens several times a year, then I may put October 2020 or July 2020, just so that I know what time of year I did that particular document. Many times this happens with open houses with schools, because they will have an open house in the fall and an open house in the spring. And that way I normally then would put what school year it's for. In the fall, it may be for the current school year, but in the spring, it may be for the following school year. So oftentimes I will put spring 2020, 2021, and then next year I'll put spring 2021, 2022, just so that I understand and I remember what one it's talking about. So always putting a year or some sort of date is very helpful. Include a version number if you have if you're producing more than one. So for instance, if you are creating if you're creating a document that you're going to have to review later and make maybe revisions to, then perhaps your version will say appeal 2020_1. And then your next one would, after you made any corrections that might be needed, you can put ._2. Then you know which one is the most current, and you can still review back on what you did in the first place. That way you can always see what was done. And finally, you should write down your naming convention in a data management plan. That sounds more difficult than it probably needs to be, but it could just be a post-it that says office project year, just so that you know that that's how you always want to name all your files. This particularly is helpful if anybody else needs to get on your computer to get anything. Maybe you're sick or you're on vacation and somebody needs to access a file. If they know how to search for it because you have it wrote down somewhere, then it makes it extremely easy to find the file and take care of the things that need to be taken care of. So again, just a short overview of what we just said, some of the elements to consider. Date of creation, short description, what the work is, maybe a location if that's important to your document, project name and number, whether it's a sample, and analysis or version number. And again, this is just some examples of how you could do it if you did the date first. Oftentimes, putting a date first is extremely helpful whenever you're trying to tell your computer how to arrange your documents. If you want to arrange your documents by date, then you're going to want your, if you can have the date first, and that way it will always align them according to the date. And that makes it an easy way to find your files and organize your files. I typically will always put the office that I'm working with first. That way I can easily put in the office and find it extremely easy. Does anybody have any questions? Would anybody like me to show them how to save anything or find things? I'd like to show you just one thing. Let me see. I will get the screen sharing up in a moment, and I will show you how you can determine whether a JPEG is good to use or not. Okay, can everyone see this screen? We're going to go to Google. Oops. So let's say I want to look for an image of, we'll say, oops, of the Virgin Mary. And I go to images. Up here in the top, right underneath the search bar, is a button called Tools. And if you click on that, you have some options that pop down. One of them is the size. And it says any size, large, medium, or icon. If you want to find a very high res, you need to select the large. That way it takes away any of the small files that might have previously been shown. So now we will go, the top layer sometimes are advertisements. So just be aware if you click on something like this one's going to take me to Amazon to buy a picture. So you just have to sometimes be careful that it might take you to another website. So this image, if we scroll down on it over here, well, these aren't showing me the, oh, here it is. So when I scroll over this image, do you see right down here in this corner image, it pops up a little gray info box. And this one says 1047 by 1650. That's the image size. So this image would be very high res. You would be able to use this image on, say, a brochure, and it would look pretty much exactly as you're seeing it on the screen here. So let's select another one and see. Again, this one set, if you go over it here, down here at the bottom, it'll tell you what the image size is again, so that you know that it is a large image. I'm going to go here and I'm going to go to any size again. And I'm going to try to find, so this image, it's a very nice image. It's already, you can already tell that it might be a little fuzzy only because it's a painting that's been scanned. And if you go over it, you can see that the image size is 431 by 588. You will not be able to make this image very large without it being pixelated. I'm going to save that, and I will open it and I'll show you in my program in just a second. So again, so when you're picking out any kind of image, always look and see what the file size is down here. If it's too small, then it's going to be pixelated and you won't be able to use it at a very large size. This one, for instance, is only 336 by 450. Again, you're going to be able to use it probably about the same size as, say, a 3 by 4 picture, if not a little bit smaller than that. So I'm going to switch a screen here so that you can see. So this is our image, and this is the actual size of the image. But if I zoom in, you can start to see that it becomes extremely pixelated. If you were to make this really large, say an 8 by 10 picture, like you wanted to print it and put it in a frame, this is how it would print. And it would be extremely fuzzy. So if the file size is larger, try to get back to the one I showed you that was a nice size. This image that I'm going to bring up, this is the image that was a very large file size. And if you were to make it larger, you see that it's still going to come out pretty crisp and clear. So when you pick a file size from Google and you want to use an image there, always check the file size and make sure that if it's anywhere over 900 by 900, then it's probably going to be a very nice image to use on any sort of flyer or worship aid or brochure that you might use. This is the same when you're using regular photos. Sometimes pulling photos, many times pulling photos off of Facebook is not a good idea because they're compressed when they're there as well. So pulling them back off makes them pixelated because they're JPEG photos. And as we talked about earlier, JPEGs compress and it takes out information and it makes it appear blurry. So whenever you're pulling from Facebook, those images are JPEGs that were already flattened and compressed, and then Facebook compresses them more. So when you pull them off, they're going to be really fuzzy. So sometimes they're not the best images to use. So let me see if I have any questions to answer over here in the yes, I did record this, so it will be able to be viewed again. And this question is, what are some options when files are too big? How can we get them safely to others? That's a great question, and I will screen share again, and I will show you one of the websites that I use. If when you are trying to send a very large file, usually that's over 20 megs, usually emails won't let you send more than 20 megs. Every email is a little bit different, might let you do a little more or a little less, but I go to a website called WeTransfer.com. And this is what it'll kind of look like. And it's free. You don't have to pay for it. And all you do, it always has different ads here. But all you do is in this white box right here, you'll put who you're sending your email to, your email, a message if you choose, and then you can put your files in here, and you can put files up to 2 gigs. That is a lot of space. So you can put several files in or just one file, and you can just hit transfer, and then it'll send an email to the person that you want to receive the document, and they just have to click on the link that is in the email, and it'll bring them to the WeTransfer platform where they can download the image directly from WeTransfer. It will also copy you, so you can also see the link and forward it on from there if you need to. These links are only available for 7 to 10 days before WeTransfer gets rid of them. So you'll need to make sure that if you do send this way, that your recipient downloads them within 7 to 10 10 days, not just business days, but regular days. And that is the easiest way to send large files if you can't send it over the email. And it's free. So many times if I have to send a large document to be proofed, that is exactly how I do it. Okay. I'm just trying to make sure. And I do want to also say that WeTransfer is safe. It does protect your files. I've never had any problems. I used to use Dropbox for many things, but it became corrupt and they had some hacking issues. So now we don't use that anymore. But WeTransfer has always seemed to be very secure and easy to send large files back and forth. Okay, if nobody has anything else, I want to thank you for coming to my session, and I hope you learned something. If you want, any of the slides or the PowerPoint will be available. And if you need any help with anything or have any questions later, please just email me or give me a call. Okay, thank you. Have a good evening.